Hello everybody, I hope you're all well. A couple of months ago, dating app Bumble, whose USP is that women have to message first, had to apologize and pull their ads because they landed themselves in quite a bit of hot water. These billboard ads featured statements like, "You know full well a vow of celibacy is not the answer," and "Thou shalt not give up on dating and become a nun." And these ads were all part of Bumble's rebrand, which Bumble had been drumming a little bit of hype up for a while. They knew that their users were getting dating app fatigue. They knew that people were craving a shift in modern day dating. Bumble specifically targeted this rebrand at women. They wiped their entire Instagram and posted these like tongue-in-cheek Renaissance era pictures of women looking bored of their male partners. After all this rigmarole, Bumble's rebrand were these sort of edgy billboards where they were like, "Celibacy isn't the answer," and also this new feature called Opening Move, which gives men the chance to message first on Bumble. Yeah. We are going to dive more into the Bumble rebrand later in this video, but this entire situation, I believe, is part of the wider cultural moment of people being sick of modern day dating and the rise of celibacy and boy sobriety. And I've been thinking a lot about critical conversations about the hoe phase as well, and how critiques of women's promiscuity can often fall into sort of two camps of actually sort of right-wing criticisms and left-wing criticisms, which is obviously something I find really interesting. Some of my friends and mutuals have already made videos about this. Khadija and Madison made respective videos about the Bumble rebrand and the hoe phase. I haven't watched them because I didn't want to accidentally rip them off in this video, but my lovely researcher Leanne watched and made notes just so I can make a video essay that comes from like a slightly different perspective or touch on some different points. But I will leave both of their videos linked down below. And just before we get into it, I would love to thank Love and Pies for sponsoring today's video. If you've been watching my video essays for a while, you know how I feel about this app. You know how I feel about this app. Love and Pies is my go-to cozy autumn game. 'Tis the season. You arrive at your mum's calf and it's all hit the fan. The place is burned down and your mum's missing. Yourself, your daughter, and a few friendly townfolk are gonna get to the bottom of what happened to your mum whilst also rebuilding her beautiful calf. You do so by combining ingredients to create dishes and drinks to serve to customers, and then using the profits to decorate your calf in whichever way you love. Personally, I love to use Love and Pies to pass the time on my phone without going on social media. I have my phone on me a lot because of work, but I'm trying to reduce my social media scrolling time. So I like that I can sort of have a little phone break but use Love and Pies and not use social media. I don't mean to brag, but I have played this game so much that my calf is decked to the nines. It's my pride and joy. And not only is Love and Pies free to download, but if you download using my link in the description and play until day 3, you will get a free gift. Yes, you will get 200 energy and 50 gems. Cha-ching. So make sure you click the link in the description to download Love and Pies today. Thank you so much, Love and Pies, for sponsoring today's video, and let's get into it. The subject I really wanted to start this video on is the current cultural conversation of women putting the hoe phase behind us. Is the hoe phase a scam? Did the hoe phase do anything to further feminism? So on and so forth. I think the hoe phase really has a place in this video because dating apps have facilitated modern day hookup culture. Modern day hookup culture would not be what it is without dating apps. Now, what is the hoe phase? It's very self-explanatory. It's a phase in a woman's life where she's a hoe. It rose to prominence in the early 2010s and it was often used in a very light-hearted manner. It was most likely born from AAVE and it is an example of reclamation language. You know, where an oppressed group, they reclaim a negative term or a slur and use it in a more positive way. The word hoe was a derogatory term towards sex workers. You know, the hoe phase is similar sort of reclamation term to like the word bitch or even Amber Rose's slut walk, which we will be talking about in this video, don't you worry. The hoe phase is associated with a very specific time in a woman's life, usually when she's at university or she's in her early 20s, which are essentially the years where it's socially acceptable to experiment with your life, whether it's romantically, sexually, deciding what job you want to do, deciding where you want to live, what you want to study, etc. Now, I'm not going to sit here and act like the hoe phase was an integral part of the sexual revolution, but it was part of the sexual revolution nonetheless. I think people tend to forget that having open discussions about taboo topics helps destigmatize these topics, and that's just a net positive in my opinion. But the hoe phase was always going to have shortcomings from a sexual liberation perspective. It's quite literally in the name, the hoe phase. Yes, it calls for normalizing female promiscuity, but it only calls to normalize a specific type of female promiscuity. Promiscuity when you're young, promiscuity if it's only a temporary phase in your life before you settle down. I do think the cultural moment that was the hoe phase does deserve some credit for destigmatizing female promiscuity, but I do think that it was always a means to fail in the larger sexual liberation movement. When discussing the supposed recent backlash against the hoe phase, whether it's from right-wing red pill podcasters, whether it's from left-leaning women becoming disillusioned with modern dating, I think it's really important to discuss whether the hoe phase was really accepted at all. What was the public reaction when the hoe phase was entering the cultural zeitgeist, and whether this newfound backlash is newfound at all. It appears that the backlash surrounding the hoe phase coincided with the rise, which doesn't surprise me at all because any sort of topic relating to female promiscuity is never going to exist in harmony. But what I will say is that the tone towards the hoe phase has definitely shifted more amongst women than men. The right-wing backlash against the hoe phase was rooted in all the usual suspects: traditional values, not having sex until marriage, a woman's role as rearing children and being a housewife. Essentially, the only sex that you should be having is for the purpose of procreation. But the backlash against the hoe phase from women, in my opinion, comes from a much more interesting place. Rather than it coming from a place of being a hoe equals bad, it's rather questioning whether the hoe phase is a scam, essentially. Whether it's truly empowering to women. And to explore this point, I think that it's important to quickly touch on the sexual liberation movement. In my opinion, the sexual liberation movement is ongoing, and it will always be ongoing for as long as people are oppressed based on their sexual desires. This includes not being able to access abortion, contraception, lack of comprehensive sex education in schools still teaching abstinence as a form of contraception, the treatment of quote-unquote promiscuous women in the legal system, the treatment of sex workers. I could go on. I truly could. But we will circle back to some of these points later. But when people are talking about the sexual liberation movement, they are often referring to that of the 60s and 70s. To quote Wikipedia, the sexual revolution, also known as the sexual liberation, was a social movement that challenged traditional codes of behavior related to sexuality and interpersonal relationships through the developed Western world from the 1960s to the 1970s. Sexual liberation included increased acceptance of sex outside of traditional heterosexual monogamous relationships, primarily marriage, the normalization of contraception and the pill, public nudity, pornography, premarital sex, homosexuality, masturbation, alternative forms of sexuality, and the legalization of abortion all followed. The sexual revolution of the 1960s grew from a conviction that the erotic should be celebrated as a normal part of life and not repressed by family, industrialized sexual morality, religion, and the state. And there were a multitude of different factors at play which created the perfect storm for the sexual revolution to happen. And I will list it off for you guys now. The contraceptive pill became available in the West in the 50s and 60s. The rise of cities eroded community-based moral policing. Essentially, you didn't have to worry about your busybody neighbor chatting about all your sexual exploits. Sex became more culturally relevant. Sex was now a prominent topic in art, poetry, and fiction. Master and Johnson published their scientific findings on the human orgasm in the late 50s. Hippies pioneering the free love movement, calling for acceptance and embracement of having multiple sexual partners. But it is important to note that the free love movement had roots very similar to the sexual liberation movement, being of the belief that people should have freedom from state regulation and church interference in personal relationships. Abortion was decriminalized in several European countries. Homosexuality was decriminalized in England and Wales, and censorship of pornography was loosened in France in 1975. I do think that people have a tendency, including myself, when thinking of the sexual revolution, they think of fighting for women's rights to have sex outside of heterosexual marriages, essentially, which, don't get me wrong, is a large piece of the sexual liberation movement. But as I've said, it spreads much wider than just sexual intercourse. It encompasses everything in relation to sex. And I think it's really important to remember the extent of sexual censorship in the 60s and 70s. I read this really interesting article in The Guardian, That's Patriarchy, How Female Sexual Liberation Led to Male Sexual Entitlement, which really brought my attention to this. Britain was operating under full theatre censorship. Lady Chatterley's lover was subject to an import ban in Australia. Married couples in sitcoms were still depicted as sleeping in different beds in American television. Female pleasure was essentially never discussed. Only in 1965 did married women in France obtain the right to work without their husband's consent. In Australia, married women couldn't apply for passports without their husband's approval. And Britain did not make marital rape illegal until 1991. And just piggybacking off that last point, something that I want to touch on in terms of the hoe phase and why I think women are becoming disillusioned with the hoe phase, separate from dating app fatigue and complaints of modern day dating. But I've been making video essays for a very long time now. I've been making video essays for 4 years, and I've spoken about many topics and how they intersect with feminism and all of the horrifying things that I have learned about the state of women's rights in this country and around the world. Honestly, how am I supposed to hoe phase in these conditions? British law has been failing women for decades now, and promiscuous women are in even more of a contentious spot. Devon and Cornwall's Police and Crime Commissioner reported that there is an epidemic of violence against women and girls. Their report shows 3,000 crimes of violence against women and girls are recorded every single day, with at least 1 in 12 women becoming victims each year. Over 1 million violent crimes against women and girls were reported between 2022 and 2023, and child sexual abuse and exploitation increased by more than 400% between 2013 and 2022. In the UK, less than 5% of recorded domestic violence crimes end in conviction. Less than 2% of reported rapes end in conviction in the UK. And in London, the conviction rates for rape are so low that rape is considered legal in this city. And, regarding the hoe phase, if you meet someone who assaults you through a hookup app, and that includes Tinder and Hinge, it's nearly impossible to get a conviction, and the way that you met them will be used against you in a courtroom. When I think of women's sexuality being weaponized against them, I think of Grace Millane. She was murdered whilst she was backpacking in New Zealand by Jesse Kempson, who she met on Tinder. He strangled her to death, buried her body, and then claimed that it was rough sex gone wrong. To quote Sky News, Cohen's film lets the evidence speak for itself. There is contradictory CCTV footage of Kempson rifling through Grace's bag when she left the table during her date, his internet search history for porn in the hours after Grace's death, as well as for Waitakere Ranges, the location where he would later bury the body. He also took photos of her, and there was no call to emergency services, no attempt to get help. When I think of women being failed by the British justice system, I think of Nicole Smallman and Biba Henry. They were 2 sisters who were murdered by Daniel Hussein in 2022. This case is very well known in the UK because 2 police officers who were on the scene, PC Deniz Jaffa and PC Jamie Lewis, took selfies with the women's bodies and posted them into a WhatsApp group chat. When I think of the British justice system failing women, I think of the murder of Sarah Everard. She was wrongfully taken into custody by off-duty police officer Wayne Couzens, who proceeded to rape and murder her. Couzens had been previously accused of indecent exposure twice and was nicknamed the rapist by colleagues. Not once was he ever suspended from work, and his lack of suspension led to an innocent woman's murder. I also think a lot about the Belfast rugby rape trial, where despite all the evidence against Paddy Jackson, Stuart Olding, Blaine McIlroy, and Rory Harrison, they were all found not guilty. Look at this environment that has been fostered for women. Despite the police commissioner themselves saying that there is an epidemic of violence against women and girls, misogyny still isn't considered a hate crime in this country. In fact, it was rejected in 2021, and it was argued that considering misogyny a hate crime would be counterproductive to reducing violence against women and girls. But how are we supposed to progress if we won't even call these crimes what they are, which is motivated by misogyny? If we don't acknowledge the most extreme forms of gender-based violence as motivated by misogyny, how are we supposed to call out the lower forms of misogyny and harassment, like catcalling, locker room and WhatsApp banter, violent pornography, as part of the pyramid of violence against women? And if you can't knock down those ones, how are you supposed to knock down the ones at the top? As I mentioned earlier, the hoe phase has received backlash from both left-wing and right-wing people. As I mentioned earlier, the backlash against the hoe phase seemingly coincided with the rise. But something which I find really interesting to talk about is the recent mainstreaming of conservative values and content, and how I think that is impacting mainstream culture as a whole. And again, I would like to note that my opinion may be skewed because I am left-wing, therefore my social media leans left-wing, all of my friendship circles are left-wing, you know, you are an echo chamber of your political opinions mostly. But something that I've noticed recently, especially since Elon Musk bought Twitter, is how pervasive right-wing content has become. No matter how your algorithm is geared, it seems to always come back like a rash. I think as a society, I hate saying that, we live in a society, we are in a particularly tricky spot because yes, as the decades have passed on, we are becoming more and more liberal and progressive as a society, and that is reflected in laws surrounding equality, for example. But something a lot more haunting is happening, and that is that people are becoming radicalized by right-wing content that is fed to them via social media algorithms. The more of this content you consume, the more you are fed of it, you end up getting stuck in this very toxic cycle. And it's even more disturbing when you realize no matter how you gear your algorithm, how many times you click not interested, this right-wing content keeps coming back. The fact of the matter is that conservative values are reaching even more audiences through social media. And something I'm really interested to explore is how as a society and as a culture we are internalizing these values. When I think of like peak modern day conservative content, I think of those red pill podcasts where they line up sex workers and berate them. I think of street interviews where men are asking women what their body count is. I think of masculinity coaches, and I think of modern day trad wife content. And a theory of mine, this is a theory, so please take this with a pinch of salt, is I think the general public are internalizing these conservative values more than we realize. And I think one way that is reflected is through modern day fashion and makeup trends. The most prominent trends of the 2020s have been trends that are really stripped back. Think about the clean girl aesthetic, quiet luxury. And to me, these trends feel very trad wife coded. And I know that these trends were also a pendulum swing away from 2010's maximalism and full glam makeup and logomania. But also these trends feel very conservative coded. These are modest ways of dressing. This is a modest way of doing your makeup, and conservative and puritanical values have always gone hand in hand. And if we just circle back to the topic at hand, I do think that some of the backlash against female promiscuity is probably rooted in people internalizing these conservative values. But it is just a theory. That's just a theory of mine. And when discussing modern conservatism, I often think of the weaponization of motherhood. I think about the weaponization of children within right-wing spaces all the time. One example of this is Roe v. Wade. Think about the emotive language used when conservatives talk about abortion. They often refer to it as child murder. I read a really good book about QAnon last summer, and so many right-wing conspiracy theories center around this idea of saving children. Pizzagate, blood libel, the list goes on. And if we just link this back to the hoe phase, a good case study for this is Amber Rose. If you don't know who Amber Rose is, she is an American model, video vixen, and TV personality. She rose to fame in the late 2000s after she starred in one of Kanye West's music videos. She proceeded to date him for 2 years. She was also married to rapper Wiz Khalifa. And Amber Rose has been on the receiving end of misogynistic abuse and harassment for years. Kanye West even said he felt the need to take 30 showers after he broke up with Amber Rose to be with Kim Kardashian. And Amber Rose was a feminist activist. She founded a feminist movement called Slut Walk. To quote exact publicity, the Amber Rose Slut Walk is a non-profit event that is playing a monumental role in the movement towards empowerment, gender equality, ending rape culture, victim blaming, slut and body shaming, and other social injustice issues. This particular movement all began back in 2011 in Toronto when a police officer told a crowd of college women that if they wanted to avoid sexual assault, they shouldn't dress like sluts. The Slut Walk has now become a global movement with grassroots success in over 200 countries. Now, would you believe me if I said that this same Amber Rose endorsed Trump in the most recent presidential election? In her speech she gave at the 2024 RNC, she emphasized her role as a mother, stating that her main concern was to provide a better future for her children, and that Trump is the best chance of giving her children a better life, regardless of political background. To quote Amber directly, she introduced herself as a model, an entrepreneur, but most importantly, a mother. When I did drama A-level, what a shock, I did drama A-level. I studied a play called Lysistrata. It's an ancient Greek play, which is about the women of Greece denying all men sex in order to end the Peloponnesian War. Now, this play was originally performed in Athens in 411 BC. And I find it so interesting that this ancient Greek play from before Christ mirrors so much of modern day celibacy and boy sobriety. As I mentioned earlier, it was expected that there was going to be right-wing backlash against the hoe phase. Anything related to women's liberation outside of buying a gun, conservatives flip their lid over. But something I want to focus on in this segment of the video is the backlash against the hoe phase, which is coming from women. And it isn't so much a backlash, but more a growing disillusionment towards modern dating, and the hoe phase and hookup culture does fall underneath that umbrella. I'm not going to get too into it because this video is already absurdly long, but the most common complaints I hear about modern day dating is essentially along the lines of these men ain't shit. Within heterosexual dating dynamics, men are not making enough of an effort, they aren't reaching a lot of women's standards, and on a more sinister note, I hear a lot of complaints about love bombing, about ghosting after more than a few dates, and if you've gone through this before, you will know that it is incredibly emotionally exhausting. I do think it's important to note the reason why women are raising their dating standards. I do have a theory that dating apps have potentially made dating worse because rather than dating mutual friends, rather than dating people that you've already met before and you already know, you're essentially dating strangers, with the mutual friends being taken out of it, with you not being able to get to know them outside of a dating context. There's essentially no way to warn you whether they're going to be a weirdo or not. But steps made within the feminist movement have absolutely contributed to why women are raising their dating standards and why so many women are choosing to be alone over being with a man who isn't treating them right. It's now the norm for women to be financially independent from their partners. Although the pressure is there is ever so slightly less pressure to conform to a traditional life and relationship timeline. In popular culture, there is a lot more emphasis on nurturing your platonic relationships and the fulfilling love that you can receive from your platonic relationships. Every time I'm hungover, I am pondering the healing powers of platonic love. Also, now we are having more open conversations about toxic relationships, about emotionally abusive relationships. Women are now feeling like they can articulate when something doesn't feel right in a relationship. Women are learning to spot red flags earlier in dating. Social attitudes towards being single are shifting. There's the rise of single positivity. People are now making more of an effort to not view being single as a transitional period in their life and, as a completely valid state of being. Before we talk about boy sobriety, I want to quickly talk about the 4B movement in South Korea, which boy sobriety essentially mirrors. I feel like boy sobriety is a slightly less political version of 4B. 4B is a radical feminist movement that comprises of the 4Bs. Biseksu, which is no sex with men, Bichulsun, no giving birth, Biyone, no dating men, Bison, no marriage with men. And 4B was a movement born from all of the feminist movements before it. It came pretty shortly after Escape the Corset, which is a feminist movement that critiqued South Korean beauty standards, and the South Korean Me Too movement. And these almost came together to create a perfect storm, which was the 4B movement. To quote Wikipedia, the 4B movement is mean to serve as a direct opposition to South Korea's patriarchal state and combat its pro-natalist policies, which view women's bodies and reproductive abilities as tools for the state's future. Feminists who engage in the 4B movement are known to actively resist the various ways in which gendered expectations are enforced in a conservative society, specifically related to child rearing, relationships, and employment. This resistance involves not only withdrawing from dating, but also rejecting prevalent gendered beauty standards and their associated consumerist practices in South Korea. In a conservative and traditional society, alternative forms of protest in the 4B movement include defying rigid beauty norms and traditional gendered expectations by shaving heads and choosing not to wear bras. 4B and also political celebration celibacy, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, are essentially very radical versions of boy sobriety. If you haven't heard of the term boy sober, it grew in popularity on TikTok in the most recent summer. It was coined by Hope Woodard, who noticed that she kept falling into the same patterns of dating one person, becoming obsessed with them, someone that she didn't really know, and she would essentially project a complete fantasy onto him, and when he didn't reach that fantasy, she was left very disappointed. It's interesting because when I first heard about boy sobriety, I assumed it was in direct response to how bad the modern day dating pool is, which it partially is. To quote Hope for Cosmopolitan, I was just on standby all the time and checking my phone like a crazy person, and I was just so aware of the fact that he couldn't have cared less if I lived or died. But something that makes a lot of sense is boy sober's focus on the self. Being boy sober is rooted in the desire to rewire your brain's approach to dating and make it less obsessive and less all-consuming. I think people tend to put the onus on women, and especially really emotionally investing in men very, very early on in dating. It's almost painted as the women's fault, when in reality, women are like this because of the way we've been raised. I really hate saying this sentence, but we do live in a society. We live in a society where romantic relationships are painted as an integral stage in everybody's lives. As humans, our goals are set out for us. We go to school, we go to university, we get a job, we find a partner, we get married, we have a baby. And although these norms have changed drastically in the last 20 years, especially the timeline for these norms, it's now a lot more socially accepted and honestly even encouraged to have children later in life, to get married later in life. You know, this is partially due to changing social attitudes, but this is also due to socioeconomic circumstances as well. But despite all of this, romantic relationships are still pedestaled as this necessary stage in everyone's lives. And if we really think about it, not only is there a social pressure to not be single, if you've been single in your 20s for an extended period of time, you will know the nagging from your family about when you're going to meet someone. Or even I'm guilty of this when I meet up with my friends. One of the first topics of conversation is whether they're dating anyone. But it's not just a social pressure. In the Western world, I'm talking specifically in the UK because that's where I live, there is also a financial pressure to being single. According to Hargreaves Lansdowne, single people on average spend £860 a month more than their coupled up counterparts. Most single people cannot afford to live alone. The government is thinking of scrapping single person discount on council tax, as if single people aren't already spending so much on their bills and rent. Like, not only do married people get to essentially pay for half of everything, but also you get tax breaks if you're married as well. Even something as simple as like the way that restaurants are formatted in this country, there's always two chairs. You always sort of feel self-conscious if you go and eat in a restaurant alone. And reading and writing all of this really reminded me of this article that was doing the round on TikTok on The Atlantic, titled "The People Who Quit Dating" by Faith Hill, where she speaks to people who quit dating. It's not as sort of concrete as celibacy, but rather these interviewees were no longer living their lives like they were on hold until they met the one. They're booking that holiday by themselves or with friends that they always thought they were going to go on with a romantic partner. They're buying that crockery set that they thought was going to be on their wedding registry. And some of these interviewees cited similar reasons as the boy sober girlies as to why they've opted out of dating. Too many false starts, projecting fantasies onto people and being left disappointed, and they're opting out of the emotional yo-yoing. But if we just circle back to boy sobriety and 4B, I do also want to touch a little bit on political celibacy. Political celibacy does differ from regular celibacy because there is a political motivator. Similar to Lysistrata, some radical feminists view celibacy as a political tool to challenge patriarchal norms and power structures. But not only this, but some radical feminists do view sex as potentially distracting from political goals. To quote Nonna Willis-Aronitz for the New York Times, "Don't let sex distract you from the revolution." In the late 1960s, several years before women's liberation had truly become a mass movement, some radical feminists came to view sex as an anathema to effective political energy. Dana Densmore, a founding member of the separatist group Cell 16, took issue with the idea that sex was a basic human need. In 1968, in a journal appropriately titled "No More Fun and Games," she wrote that gorillas had important things to do and couldn't be sidetracked by sex, which was inconvenient, time-consuming, energy-draining, and irrelevant. As you guys can probably tell, a lot of women are opting to go celibate. They are opting to go sober from men. They are choosing to quit dating. And I want to sort of piggyback off this point of quitting dating and sort of link it with dating apps and talk about why dating apps are in crisis. this. I would just like to say that my throat is getting very sore. I'm not very well, if you couldn't tell by the sound of my voice. So I'm really straining right now. As I mentioned earlier, dating app usage and shares are down all across the board. And the main contributor to this phenomenon is dating app fatigue. I'm not going to get too into it because I've been talking for way too long now, but essentially people are getting really sick of using dating apps. The girls are tired, and so are the guys as well. I haven't even been using dating apps for that long, and already I'm really tired of them. I barely use them anymore. The repetitive conversation, the limited dating pool, the ghosting, the love bombing are just a few reasons cited as to why people are getting dating app fatigue. And Bumble was clearly feeling the burn, hence their rebrand. As I mentioned earlier, Bumble got a little bit of heat for their celibacy isn't the answer billboards. And alongside this, Bumble launched their new feature First Move, which gives men the opportunity to message first. And it does really make me laugh because this reminds me so much of BoJack Horseman. There was this plotline in BoJack Horseman when Todd creates this cab company, which is women drivers for women customers only. And then he says, why don't we make this a safe space for women and men? And then only hires sexy women drivers to drive around men. Why is Bumble giving cabracadabra? But I do think that dating app users are so prone to fatigue because dating apps are dealing with some of the most emotive and high stakes situations possible. They are dealing with people's physical appearance, finding love, and also the fear of being alone. If you spent literally just a few hours on dating apps, you will know how like frivolous and callous they are. And I'm not anti-dating app, by the way. I use a dating app and it's like fine. I've had success, but because the stakes are so high, I think it's no wonder that dating apps are a failing model. And something that I haven't mentioned throughout this video is at the end of the day, dating apps are a business model and they're here to make a profit. Dating apps essentially work on a freemium model. They are free to download, but if you want the premium features, you got to cough up. And most dating apps premium features include unlimited likes and also pushing your profile out to more people. I have actually made a podcast episode about dating apps if you want to listen more about this subject. And something that I've actually noticed using Hinge, and by the way, I don't pay for Hinge, I will never pay for a dating app a day in my life, is that the language they use is actually quite emotionally manipulative. I'm not a dating app hater, I'm not a Hinge hater, but if you have like no likes, they'll say, oh, like no likes, don't worry, we're here to help. And this idea that if you pay them, they will find you a higher quality and quantity of matches if you just fork out £10 a month. And look, this stuff on me doesn't work, but I can imagine if you're in a little bit of a vulnerable spot, I mean, no wonder so many people pay for dating apps, right? And dating apps are in a really tricky spot at the moment, hence the failed Bumble rebrand, because women are using dating apps less and less. Already, there is a large gender disparity on dating apps. More men than women use dating apps, so much so that back in the day before dating apps, there were a few dating websites that got into a lot of controversy because they were creating fake women profiles to keep men using their dating websites. But not only do more men than women use dating apps, but men swipe right on 61% of women's profiles, meanwhile women swipe right on just 5% of men's profiles. Sorry, Jordan from the future just jumping in. I forgot to add the most important part to this point in this video is that not only is there a major gender disparity within dating app usage, but also dating app satisfaction, but also dating apps are in a particularly contentious spot because women are the product. This incredible TikToker, I'm going to put her name on the screen now, said this exact thing, that women are the product on dating apps, which is why it's so important for dating apps to keep women on, which is why they're scrambling, trying to think of rebrands, trying to think of anything apart from addressing the root issue, which is men are trash. And essentially Bumble's answer to women's growing dissatisfaction with modern day dating was you should just lower your standards rather than like men should be better. And the thing is that what I sort of want to wrap this video up on is that dating apps can't make men better. We can't really blame dating apps for the state of modern day dating. Dating apps can definitely implement more rules and regulations to keep these apps more safe, to keep people from verbally abusing women on these apps. But for men to change, there has to be a much larger cultural shift. And I don't think that Hinge and Bumble could do that on their own. My final thoughts, the way I have no final thoughts because I'm so tired, like I don't even have a conclusion or anything, and my throat is so sore. Essentially, I think that all of these contributing factors of dating apps, internalizing conservative ideals, women becoming more disillusioned, the feminist movement is making women question what they truly want and raising their standards, is the reason why people are becoming so disillusioned with modern day dating and hookup culture and dating apps. that's in the hoe phase. Do I have anything else? No. Being single is fun, and invest in your platonic relationships. That's my takeaway. Invest in your platonic relationships. I'm pondering the healing powers of platonic love again. I love you guys. I'm sorry if this wasn't a very good sign off on my video or a very good video at all. Sometimes I feel like my brain's going to explode like every day, but see you guys soon. Bye.